Make no mistake, the folks in Beijing are keenly watching this visit. I bet they won't like what they see. A massive reception, a state banquet, all of it signals growing cooperation between India and the US. And that's bad news for China. Back in New Delhi, there is consensus on one thing. China is the new big challenge, not Pakistan. China is a challenge. Here in Washington, there is a similar consensus. China and not Russia is the chief rival now. So there is unity on that front. There may be difference on the approach, but the sentiment is the same. China means bad news. How is Beijing reacting to this consensus? Well, there are 5 stages of grief, they say, and China is on the first stage, denial. Their former foreign minister, Wang Yi, wrote an opinion piece this week. The headline sums up the story. This is what it says. India's economic ties with the US cannot replace its trade with China. One question though. Is he telling this to the world or trying to convince himself? Now, Wang Yi is still a prominent figure in Beijing. When US Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited China, he had 3 meetings, and one of those meetings was with Wang Yi. So what he says carries weight. It's not the musings of a former diplomat. Let me quote some important bits from what he has written. As feared by many Indian elites, Washington's vigorous efforts to strengthen economic and trade cooperation with India is primarily to slow down China's economic development. Let me simplify that. Wang Yi says America has an ulterior motive, that they're using India only to weaken China. He says Washington pays lip service but seldom delivers. Broadly speaking, this op-ed has 3 arguments. 1, America is not genuine, it is only using India. 2, India cannot replace China in the global supply chain. And 3, nothing can stop the rise of China-US trade or India-China trade. Now let's analyze these arguments. Is America really playing India? Well, if they are, the acting is top class, we have to say. It's up to Joe Biden to disprove Wang Yi's statement. India has made the leap of faith. The US needs to reciprocate with concrete moves. As for supply chain and trade, it's too early for that really. Yes, bilateral trade is growing, but these things cannot change overnight, or for that matter in 1 or 2 years. Realigning trade and supply is a long game. It takes years. The fact that India and the US are doing that, working towards that, has spooked Beijing. Wang Yi also has some advice for New Delhi. He says promote trade and cooperation with China. Well, why not? It's not like China tried to seize Indian territory or killed Indian soldiers. Except they did exactly that. India's position on China has been clear. In fact, the Prime Minister reiterated it during an interview. This is what he said. For normal ties with China, peace and tranquility in the border is essential. China doesn't seem to understand that. Their proposal is this: forget the border, let's increase trade. I'm afraid that won't fly. America's equation with China is also complicated, minus the border. Let's look at the events of this week. Joe Biden sent his top diplomat Antony Blinken to Beijing. The expectations were rock bottom. And so were the results. It was actually classic Cold War playbook. Both sides agreed to stabilize relations, but they did nothing to actually implement that. In fact, Biden may be doing the opposite. He attended a campaign event on Tuesday, Joe Biden, and he spoke about the spy balloon saga between the US and China. And while doing that, he called Xi Jinping a dictator. He said Xi was embarrassed because he didn't know where the balloon was. Needless to say, China is not happy. Their foreign ministry has called it absurd and irresponsible.
The relevant remarks by the US side are extremely absurd, irresponsible, and seriously violate basic facts, diplomatic protocol, and China's political dignity. They are an open political provocation. China is strongly dissatisfied with and firmly opposed to this.
Question to China though. What do you call an unelected leader who has appointed himself for life? If not a dictator, then what? Biden and Modi will have to figure that out. China may not be the only issue on the agenda, but it's an important and urgent one. Something that even voters in both countries realize, which is why Biden said that he did what he did at the campaign event. He called Xi a dictator. New Delhi and Washington will have to figure out a roadmap. What will the US-India plan against China look like? Is it purely economic? Is it purely strategic? Is it a mix of the two? Let's see if tomorrow's bilateral gives us some answers to these questions.